there's actual research that shows if you do everything barefoot, like all the time, full believer, all barefoot, you actually almost become weak in that sense. As soon as you put on shoes, it's like your kryptonite.
You're listening to the PJF Podcast, a show dedicated to decoding elite sports performance and fitness. I'm Paul Fabritz, and I'm an MBA strength and conditioning and performance trainer. If you want to become superhuman, take your fitness, and take your sports performance to the next level, this is the podcast for you. Let's do it.
All right, so let's dive straight in. You want to give us a quick background on who you are and what you do?
Absolutely. So Dr. Emily, functional podiatrist, human movement specialist. I've been in the fitness industry for over 20 years. Was a former competitive gymnast. That's really how I got into my love for fascia training, body tension, just body weight athlete kind of type training. In podiatry, I take a very integrated perspective. I actually get patients out of their orthotics, out of supportive shoes. I'm doing full movement assessments. Typically, I'm getting referrals where other docs or professionals are like, this patient is not responding to what I'm giving them. Maybe it's something with the way that the foot is relating to the ground. And then I will take a look, and I take a big sensory perspective at everything. I feel that the foot is the gateway into the brain, and that is a really big part of what just infiltrates into every aspect of how I approach movement and patients.
Awesome. Yeah, and so give the listeners a little background on your company. It's Naboso, right? Yeah, so I have a couple of those products. I have the insoles that I love, with the texture. And then I have the mat as well. And I'm loving those products. We use it with all of our NBA guys. We start off workouts barefoot on the mat, and they really like it. Personally, I feel like the insoles have been big for me. I'll walk around in them barefoot, and I just have an awareness of where my met heads are, and I can feel that tripod. Whereas in normal shoes with a sole this thick, it's like I can never feel where my feet are in space. So give a little bit of background on that.
Cool. Yes. So Naboso is a sensory-based product line that I launched 4 years ago, and all of the products utilize texture. So there is texture or little tiny pyramids across every single product that we incorporate. And the texture is designed to stimulate the nerves in the bottom of the feet and technically the palm of the hand, because the nerves are the same. The products that we develop through that, you mentioned a couple. So insoles, mats, we have socks, release tools, a sensory stick, flooring. We're developing a couple other products for like Pilates machines and stuff like that. And really the goal is to help people activate, tune into their feet, really feel that foot posture and foot awareness with every step that they do or every move that they make. And what I was finding as a functional podiatrist is that as soon as people get into shoes, there's this sensory disconnect that is just inherent. And even in minimal shoes, you get a slight sensory disconnect to the full foot placement and weight shift and pressure distribution. So we often say that we're bringing barefoot into the shoe and really wake it up. The way that you said you walk around barefoot in your shoes to just like prime the nervous system is one of my favorite applications, especially for athletes, is let's just turn on all the light switches, right? And then put your shoes on, get on the court, get on the field, whatever you're doing.
Yeah, it's awesome. So anybody listening to this, I would recommend checking that out, because those have made a huge difference in my foot and also our NBA players as well. They love it. How important do you think it is to just get out of the shoes in general? Walk around. I've heard so many different opinions on it. I've heard everything ranging from everything you do in training should be barefoot to like maybe just walk around barefoot. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, we know that a lot of sports are shod, or they have to wear shoes, right? So basketball, football, any of those, even hockey, many of these sports require you to be in some sort of footwear or apparatus that's interacting with the foot. So I look at barefoot training, like I said a little bit earlier, is this activation technique. I call it barefoot before shod. Now, outside of athletics and priming the nervous system before you put your shoes on and you train or you play a game, compete, etc., there's actual research that shows if you do everything barefoot, like all the time, full believer, all barefoot, you actually almost become weak in that sense. As soon as you put on shoes, it's like your kryptonite, right?
Yeah.
And I often give this example that I love to train barefoot. I totally am like doing exactly what I just said don't do, but I absolutely love training barefoot. I would rather do kettlebells barefoot and everything, no shoes. As soon as I put on even my Vivo barefoots and do kettlebells, my foot awareness and the accuracy and the weight shift as I'm swinging the bell is just a little bit clumsy. So there's research that shows the most trained foot and ankle structure, especially in athletes, is if you are barefoot and then you train minimal and then you train in whatever your competition footwear would be, and to transfer some of those same sports. So do the kettlebell swings or the box jumps barefoot, minimal shoes, cleats, or whatever your competition shoes would be.
Right. That makes sense. Yeah, that's something that I didn't know there was research behind that, but that's something I always felt is like if I went too far on that barefoot side, putting on shoes, like you said, it's kryptonite. It's so uncomfortable and it feels heavy. I always wonder about like, a lot of our reflexes are responding to vibrations from the floor. And if everything is barefoot, those vibrations get there fast, but then you got these thick shoes on and the timing of the vibrations changes depending on the thickness of the shoe. So I think some people might go a little bit too far of like everything barefoot, and then you're not trained for what you're actually going to be competing in. And then the other thing for me is like, the idea of barefoot running might fix your, put you on the ball of the foot, right? Get you off the heel because it hurts when you heel strike. And so, people say that it kind of fixes your mechanics, but as a basketball player, the heels are a good thing. Like we want to decelerate on the heels. When I jump, there's going to be heel. And so if I do too much of that stuff barefoot, it's a lot of like the heel hitting and kind of like, maybe even if the heel did adapt, I don't know if that's an adaptation that I want it to make. So I think that's a good point of like, do a little bit of both.
Yeah, it's really variability in stimuli. And this is everything that you're doing, right? Is you want to continuously shift and surprise and re-stimulate or challenge the nervous system in different ways. And I go a ton into instability training and proprioceptive versus mechanoceptive training. And sometimes I will challenge Eric's pads and wobble boards and things like that. But there is a time and place for every single one of those modalities and say, okay, what am I getting from having my feet on a Bosu, right, versus a hardwood floor? Is it good to challenge the nervous system in all those different ways? Absolutely. Just know why you're doing something and make sure you're not going all in all the time on an Eric's pad and you're still pulling in some barefoot, hardwood floor just to create that balance.
Right. 100%. And then as far as like the difference between, I've heard you talk about like isolated training versus integrated, and you're big into integration, which I love. I think a lot of the isolation stuff gives you like this quick little, it feels good because it burns, but it just doesn't integrate into the whole system. And it feels like guys are more disconnected when they do more of that isolation work. Talk a little bit about that difference between like why is it so important to be integrated?
Yeah, 100%, especially as it relates to the foot. So a lot of people typically and historically thought of the foot as, okay, I'm going to do towel crunches, toe yoga, pick up marbles, things like this that are very isolated. And we know that similar to, if you do just this isolated bicep curl, I would think do pull-ups or do some sort of row as a more integrative technique. Mm-hmm. But so that isolated manner does not mean that it's technically going to function dynamically during some sort of human movement. And where I look at the foot from an integrated structure is that your deep foot muscles, the intrinsics, the core of your foot is myofascially and muscle synergistically connected to your pelvic floor. So that means that your base of support and your foot ground contact and relationship is directly correlated to your center of mass and the perception of a shift in your center of mass. So this foundation center has to be integrated. It's fascially designed that way. And then of course it continues into your diaphragm. So when I teach foot integration, I'm cueing breath at a very specific moment. I'm cueing pelvic floor tension techniques. I have to actually cue tongue to palate at certain times to activate these full fascial lines so that that then is trained in a way that subconsciously it will work during high level performance. If you just train the foot doing towel crunches, does not mean that, especially as soon as you put your shoes on and you're on the court, that your foot is going to be strong and going to lead to stronger glute activation. So we need to train it, understanding this neurological connection.
Yeah. I've always wondered when people do like an isolation for one muscle, it's like, how do you hit all of these muscles equally? Because there's so many muscles crossing the ankle. It's like, how are we possibly isolating each of them? You know, say there's 26 or whatever crossing the ankle. How are we doing 26 isolations for all these? And if you were, how do you even have that time to do that? So it's like, for me, from a time perspective, it always goes back to, we just got to integrate it all together. And so for us, it's like, you know, let's as long as there's no injury, I want to get them into like multi-directional plyometrics as quick as possible, just because I found that that's one of the best ways to train every single muscle down there. And it has to be integrated.
100%. I actually think a lot of this isolation, maybe some of that was like physical therapy, like, okay, I'm going to very specifically target the supraspinatus of your rotator cuff or something like that, or like bodybuilding. So they're trying to actually like hit very specific angles of a muscle for definition, which those purposes make sense. The foot, one, the intrinsic muscles do not hypertrophy in that same way. They're not show muscles, right? And they're very co-contraction based muscles. Like the pelvic floor, I never train the pelvic floor in isolation. It's the pelvic floor with the TVA, with the diaphragm, with the obliques. So it's very, very similar to how really the core, and you said that you're doing with that multi-directional movement, which is hitting the co-contraction action of the core.
Absolutely. I'm curious because I have a newborn in the house, 11 weeks old. What can we do from day one? Because I'm trying to turn him into a phenom, of course. But from day one, what are some stuff for foot health? Like, do we keep him out of the shoes, or kind of what's the approach there?
Absolutely. Congratulations. I love newborns. Yes. So sensory stimulation. I know the cute little socks and little baby shoes. Get them off. Stay barefoot as much as you can. My daughter's now almost 3, but from the day she was born, she was on the Naboso mat, and we would do tummy time on the mat. I would do a lot of hand and foot massages, actually total body massages, but really focusing hand and feet. There's some really interesting research that shows, it's a little bit older, so a 7-month-old baby, but they would stimulate the feet and then show different parts of the brain activating in the somatosensory cortex. And then they would touch someone else's foot. So the baby was looking at another foot being touched, and the same area in the somatosensory cortex activated, which I just think that is super, super cool.
That's crazy.
Getting them as much into that sensory environment from texture, vibration, stretch, massage, pressure, all of that.
I've heard theories of people making their kid, like forcing them to walk or forcing them to stand too early, creates compensations because they don't actually have the strength, like they didn't develop the strength through crawling for long enough. Is there any truth to that?
Yeah, 100%. And I'm not going to say that any of my education is the experts in that aspect, but DNS, if you're familiar with it, it's a Czech-based program. Yeah, they're all into primitive reflexes developmentally through children and how they start to let go certain reflexes. But what I will say is that, because this will be, you have a little boy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That if he just naturally gravitates towards a high body awareness, which could just be, genetic. It could be from you introducing sensory stimulation. I didn't put my daughter in anything that accelerated her sitting up or walking, but she walked at 8 months. And I remember people saying like, oh, shame, shame, shame. She bypassed the crawling phase or the creeping phase too quickly. And I was like, not me.
Yeah.
If her nervous system was developed for that, then, all for that. I think that sometimes they don't want to bypass, let's say, the crawling, so you really get that scap and shoulder and the reciprocal movement. But if they take on a more adult reciprocal walking pattern with good thoracic and pelvic rotation, then I would be less concerned of a child walking earlier. So you still want to get those patterns. Something that if a child does walk a little bit early, gymnastics and martial arts and like these sports actually gravitate children towards those patterns anyway.
Awesome. And then as far as like a foot structure, so I'm all obsessed, like looking at his foot structure, and I look at our NBA players' foot structure, and it's so different. The guys who jump 45 inches, it's so different than what we would think. When I first started, I would think, okay, we need these guys with these high, strong arches. And it turns out that our most explosive athletes have very flat feet, strong feet, functional feet, but they're very flat. Have you seen that? And is there any explanation to why that might be a hidden superpower?
Yeah. So what I would actually look at in these athletes, and then for the listeners, if they're curious, just even within themselves or their athletes, is look at the Achilles tendon. And what my guess is that they're really utilizing strong plantar flexion torque out of that Achilles tendon and that recoil. And there is tons of research showing different Achilles tendon anatomy, and the longer the Achilles tendon can actually harness a lot more elastic potential than shorter Achilles tendons. So you might have an athlete with a high arch, beautiful, tend towards a more supinated foot, but a shorter Achilles tendon. And then you have one of your athletes that's more planus or flat, doesn't have that same capacity to really lift that midfoot, but then has a long, beautiful Achilles tendon, and they're really harnessing the power from the tendon.
Yeah.
So different aspects. There's arch compression, which is the arch compressing and stretching the plantar fascia and all of the fascial structures of the bottom of the foot. I would say your athletes are probably less plantar foot elastic power, and they're more Achilles tendon ankle torque is where they're getting a lot of that power from.
Right. Yeah. And I can look at their calf, and it's like this small little ball at the top of their shin, and then the rest of their leg is all Achilles. Like if you look at Michael Jordan or Kobe Bryant, like they have the longest Achilles and then these small little calves.
Yep.
Yeah.
Really where it's coming from.
Do you know if that would like increase injury risk, or like if that flat foot, long Achilles, is that going to be increased risk of plantar fasciitis or anything?
I think that if they are trained appropriately, so progressively trained, and they really harness the elastic power within the tendon, they really focus on supporting Achilles tendon recovery and things like that, where I'm always a little bit more hesitant when they start to first experience some of the Achilles tendinitis, and then they push through it, no pain, no gain, and they just start this unraveling of the Achilles tendon, which for all the listeners, Achilles tendinitis of any tendon is just one of the hardest to get under control. Once that snowballs in one direction, to like reel it in, it just has a very compromised blood supply, it has a different anatomy structure to it, but once it's optimized, it is a badass tendon. But once it starts to kind of slide out of control, so you really want to keep good control over that tendon.
And do you see Achilles tendonitis or tendinopathy in younger patients? I've heard it's like an old man thing, like above 30 is when we got to worry about that. But I've heard of a few people like getting little flare-ups in the tendon in high school, but it's like they bounce back. Whereas the guys above 30, it's like a chronic, like multi-year thing. Do you see like younger people getting it?
Always ask. So when someone says, my Achilles hurt or my heel hurts, my heel meaning posterior, not plantar. So plantar heel is going to be the plantar fascia. Posterior heel, or even on the medial lateral aspect of the calcaneus, so kind of hugging right down on the outside of the heel bone, that would be more of a insertional Achilles tendinitis, which is really a calcaneal periostitis. That would be more of these younger guys. That'd be your younger guys, right? And some of that could be like, okay, I'm pulling in this broad fascial way, or I'm hitting the heel on the ground excessively, and the vibration is irritating the periosteum on the calcaneus. So it's a little bit different. The one that where you will see it in older athletes or men, it's stereotypically men over 40, is mid-tendon. So the middle of the tendon, if they're saying it hurts right in the middle of the tendon, about 1 inch from its insertion, right? That you're then looking at, okay, we have something with the elasticity of the rubber band of the tendon, and they may have a history of this, that we're starting to get degeneration, and the mechanical properties of the tendon fibers is starting to change. The collagen is changing a little bit. Those are the ones that you want to be very careful for a rupture. And that would be, again, every Achilles tendon rupture I've ever seen in my practice, practicing 12 years as a podiatrist, have been in men over 40, playing basketball or football with their kids or something, and they just go for a quick shot, or they jump and they rupture.
Yeah, common one for like guys above 30 that I've seen with the ruptures is a big change in load, where they're like not jumping and running consistently, and then they're like lifting weights or something, then all of a sudden they go play basketball, and it's like the tendon just wasn't used to that elastic return, and it just snapped. Do you see that it does come with warning signs? Does it come with tendinopathy progressing into that, or is it just like a random thing?
There is almost always a history of, I've had Achilles tendon issues, I've always had tight ankles, I've always had really tight calves, something that the patient or the individual would have to recall. This could even be like, hey, when I was a high school basketball player, I used to have XYZ, just kind of like, would always be the area that would irritate me. Now they're 45, right? And they're saying like, okay, and I don't warm up the same. I stand for work. I stand a lot. So my feet and my calves are always tight from standing. And then they don't warm it up the same way. Or like you said, the ballistic demands of like basketball and jumping, especially that jumping and landing or something, they're just not trained for that.
Yeah, I feel like jumping and running is one of those things where you just got to do it consistently throughout your life. And if you take a big period off, you got to really be very gradual, very patient in how you get back to it. And humans just aren't patient enough to do that. It's like, I once played basketball for 2 hours, so why can't I just hop in and do that? So that's normally what I see, is just a lack of patience. As far as you mentioned the tight calves, and that's the number one complaint that I've heard in most basketball players. What are we doing about tight calves? Are you going to do direct stretching, or do we think about it as like a center of gravity issue? Do we need to make changes upstream? Where do you go with that?
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways that I will approach it. Is if the tight calves, one, I want to figure out if it is a hypertonicity, meaning is it just a little bit shifting more towards baseline hypertonic spastic, right? When that is the case, I'd like to use vibration to cause a relaxation versus just traditional SMR or foam rolling trigger point release. So I would say either get your calves on a power plate or something, or any of these vibration rollers, so that you're incorporating the neurological component to the hypertonicity. I will always look at calves, quads. So posterior lower leg, anterior upper leg, because there's a strong correlation between tight there, tight top. And then like you were kind of alluding to, that the pelvis is probably rotating forward. Yeah. And then when it's rotating forward, you are pulling and stretching the posterior line. That all the calf stretching in the world is not going to make your calves relax or more flexible if your pelvis is in an anterior tilt. Right. One thing that I do want to say though, real quick, is that what I teach in my workshops outside of just tight calves is limited ankle mobility, which is one of the biggest things out there is like, my ankles are tight. Is it tight calves? Do I have hypertonicity in my calves? Do I have a structurally short Achilles tendon? That is something that you want to think about as well, is that you could just have a baseline end stretch of your collagen in your Achilles tendon, and any foam rolling, releasing, stretching, eccentrics, it's not lengthening, right? So one, you have to accept that.
Yeah.
The other big one that I see is that there's a shift in the talus. So you could actually have a bony block in the ankle joint because your talus shifted forward. And then when your tibia tries to come forward to flex your ankle, it just hits the talus and you can't move forward. The way that typically presents, little bit side tangent, I do apologize, would be more like an anterior lower leg hypertonicity, because they're trying to pull the tibia forward when they're flexing the ankle. So that's kind of some of the other ones that I see. So any tight calves, I have to investigate a little bit more down.
Yeah, you make a good point about the structurally short Achilles, because I think everybody is so obsessed with ankle range of motion, and it is important for a basketball player to be able to drop the shin and produce horizontal force. And people just obsess over it, but I have seen people flaring up some plantar fasciitis and some Achilles pain by just jamming the ankle dorsiflexion, trying to get it more and more, or just driving the knee as far over the toe as they can and doing that too often. It's like, it might not be a soleus problem, right? It might actually be a structurally tight Achilles. And if that's the case, then all that stuff is just going to tug on it more and more and more.
Yeah, 100%. That's why I always tell people it's not limited ankle dorsiflexion is not always quote unquote tight calves, right?
Yeah.
And you want to understand a little bit more. Is it the gastroc? Is it the soleus? Is it the structurally short tendon? Is it the pelvis is forward? Is it the bottom of the foot? Are you an overpronator? Is it a bony block? Right. So there's a lot that goes into that. So I'm glad that you referenced that as well, that we don't want to just force range of motion.
Yeah. Is there any way for like people at home to do like a quick, easy test to find out if they have that structurally short Achilles? Or is that kind of a thing that you need somebody in person to look at?
Well, I'll give you where I typically will see it. One, you can't assess it on yourself. So I'm sorry. Sorry to the listeners. But there's certain patterns that you will see. So any sort of early heel lift. So an early heel lift would be like a really bouncy gait, right? It's the walk of a friend that you can tell it's them, a block away. You're like, oh, my friend's coming over, right? Because you can recognize the pattern. So that early heel lift, anytime I see an early heel lift in my office, I ask if they were toe walkers as children. Like at any point, did you toe walk as a child, right? Even as for a year, and then you kind of leveled out. That often will signify also that it is a structurally short Achilles tendon. Sometimes people will say, I can't be barefoot. Like, love minimal shoes, but it just like hurts my feet, the bottom of the foot and the back of the heel, to be totally barefoot. Typically that will kind of reference that as well, that they need a little bit of a drop. And then any history of insertional Achilles tendon issues.
Yeah, I just saw somebody yesterday actually who had these huge, strong calves. And I was like, wow, what do you do for calves? And she was like, I've never trained my calves, but I walk on my toes. So it's like, yeah, that's your workout at all times. You're just doing calf raises basically. And then as far as like, you mentioned the heel drop. Some of the training shoes that a lot of our guys train in are like the typical Nike or Adidas trainers where the heel is pretty high and then it slopes down. Do you have any thoughts on, is that going to lead to a negative adaptation? I've heard people say that it could potentially shorten the Achilles over time. Is there any truth to that?
So yes, I would say yes and no. Yes and no. So when you do wear a heel toe drop that is putting the foot in a plantar flex position, is going to slightly structurally shorten the Achilles tendon. Now, this is where there's like yes and no, right? How many hours is the athlete in that type of shoe? Do they train barefoot? Are they doing SMR and release and mobility work? Are they making sure that they stretch their ankles? So is there this whole other aspect to their programming that is going to reverse any potential taking tension off of the Achilles tendon that heel toe drop is going to do? Now, where to an extreme that I feel people's mind go, especially in the like total drink the Kool-Aid barefoot minimal space, which I love it, but I'm very not biased in my approach to human movement and footwear, is they would take someone who's in like a 5-inch stiletto all the time, women classically in those shoes, and then they literally cannot bring their heel down. That is like a very extreme example. In these athletes that you're working with, my guess is they're doing daily SMR, they're getting barefoot, they're doing their movement prep, they're wearing some sort of maybe minimal shoe outside of being on the court in a drop, so that they're trying to find that balance. So, you know, I would say take a little pearl of that perspective and then see, okay, we just always want to find balance on that.
Yeah, I think the problem might become these guys, like they revolve their fashion around it. So it's like off the court, they're in it. And then a lot of times they'll do their shooting sessions in it. And then they'll do their strength training in it. So yeah, I guess it's just like total time you spend in that shoe versus what you're spending out of the shoe.
But you could say, hey, if, you know, one of those athletes who's always in that has a structurally short Achilles tendon, technically they're not making the Achilles tendon shorter. They're putting the foot in a position that their unique anatomy is comfortable, right? Yeah. So I kind of, sometimes I feel like a politician answering this because I'm trying to like defend all aspects, but we really want to make sure we're understanding the full context and the individuality of each of those situations. And as much as possible, find that balance and get into all environments and get these athletes, hey, if you're going to wear those off of the court, I need you doing daily SMR to the foot and to the calves and stuff like that.
And then is there any place for orthotics? I know you mentioned your thing is like, let's get you out of that. Let's strengthen the foot. Is there any time where you're like, okay, this person needs orthotics, or is that never an option?
Yeah, no. So again, I'll go back to my politician hat. Depends on the foot. Yep. But there are exceptions to every rule. And I do orthotics out of my office in certain situations where I truly feel, because of ligament laxity, their foot needs some sort of mechanical control. So that's the big thing that I'm looking at, is not every flat foot is created the same. Every cause of flat feet, quote unquote flat feet, is not the same. Where I start to get a little bit more concerned is mid-foot pronation versus rear foot pronation. So this would be the foot where it looks like the middle of the foot is just spilling down into the midline of the body, and creating a large kind of C shape to the foot as it's dropping down. That is almost always ligament laxity or a tear within the spring ligament. So there's ligament issues, and no amount of strengthening the foot muscles, no amount can override ligament laxity or torn ligaments in the foot.
And if that's the case, then you would say, let's put them in an orthotic?
Yes. And then what I do, because I still want to think about the sensory aspect of the human foot, is that I will say, okay, here's your mechanical arch support that for a basketball player, I would say, I need to play with the shell. I don't have an orthotic with me. I do. Sorry, I'm just going to grab it real quick. The shell here. So the shell has a certain flex to it. This is just one sort of rigidity. I can make that shell flex to provide a dynamic structure to the athlete's foot. So I take that into consideration. That's how I view orthotics more as a functional podiatrist. Doesn't mean every podiatrist does that, but I want this to still be a mechanically supportive, but still provide some sort of dynamic energy return to the athlete. So I will do that. And then on top of it, I will put the material of the Naboso top cover. So there would be texture on the top of this so that I'm stimulating the foot. I'm mechanically supporting where the ligament laxity has fallen short, but I'm still allowing the natural dynamic nature of the human foot through the compression of the shell.
Right. That makes sense.
Yeah.
And then as far as basketball players, I think most of us, our feet function really well until we start racking up sprained ankles. That's kind of my theory, is that it all starts with like that initial sprain, and none of us rehab it. We don't take it serious. It's like, I'm back next week as soon as it stops hurting. Do you see any like major compensations after sprained ankles, or do you see it being a problem that people really don't treat it as a serious injury and then they just bounce back as soon as it's out of pain?
Oh, yes. Chronic ankle instability. They have conferences and all they do is talk about chronic ankle instability because it is such a big issue and concern. And really what a lot of the research has shown is the best way to prevent CAI or chronic ankle instability is to prevent that first ankle sprain. So they're going after all the high school athletes and saying that's where we need to stop it, is in high school, versus collegiate and pro. They've kind of like missed that window, right? Yeah. But yeah, we're actually doing a research study with Arizona State University with the Naboso Insoles for chronic ankle instability to try to make up for that neurological deficit. And one of the biggest things when it comes to ankle sprains is if you partially tear a ligament or partially tear a retinaculum or totally tear a ligament or two ligaments or whatever it is, you've lost some of that mechanical stability. And your first barrier to stability is mechanical. Then you have neurological, which is the proprioceptive and the fascial, and that's the side I love. But proprioceptive or neurological can never replace mechanical. It can't.
And what do you mean by mechanical?
Mechanical would be the actual ligament integrity.
Okay, right.
So I have a partial tear in a ligament. It's like a monkey wrench. And this is with everything from a adductor strain to, a bicep tendon tear. As soon as you get a break in connective tissue integrity, you have a break in connective tissue integrity, a partial tear, a split tear, something, you will never be 100%. And the neurological training of the fascial proprioceptive system can never replace that mechanical disruption, right? Which is where surgery comes in. So a lot of these athletes will get tendons surgically repaired, reapproximated, things like that, to try to override that mechanical deficit, let's say. And it's like a monkey wrench into the timing of stabilization. So what the mechanical disruption does is it just keeps kind of unraveling how quickly you can stabilize neurologically over here. Mm-hmm. So it's a really, really important part of total body soft tissue mechanics that I love for coaches to understand.
Yeah, it's almost like, there's nothing you can really do because we're going to land on feet. You're going to jump up and not know somebody's foot is under you. You're going to roll it. It's like, no matter how much prevention stuff we do, the ankle sprain is coming. It's a matter of when. And then now we play so much basketball because of AAU. We'll play 6 games every single weekend from age 10 all the way through age 20. So it's just, and the more games you play, the more risk you're going to have for those sprains. Is there anything, so once you have that chronic instability, is there anything that we can do, right? Like if I have my left ankle that's just, it doesn't have the same stability without a doubt, but I seem to be doing pretty well because I've strengthened and, like my peroneals might work extra hard to hold it in place. And that's not the ideal situation, but I'm getting by and I'm still able to move how I want to move. Do you think it is possible to have that chronic ankle instability and then still go on to have a long, healthy career?
100%. I think that's where going back to then thinking about the foot from an integrated perspective, right? So if I could get, the foot, core, pelvic communication a little bit faster and the anticipatory effect of the feet, hip stabilizers talking, then the glutes can engage a little bit faster, and then your lateral line is stabilized. And therefore we kind of have this domino effect of just a little bit faster stabilization, reaction time, anticipation, etc. For sure. And I think that that may be where some of the research in proprioceptive rehab with CAI is looking at it very isolated. It's okay, I'm going to do 6 weeks of wobble board. I'm going to do I'm going to, tape. I'm going to brace. I'm just doing something really locally at the foot and the ankle versus, okay, well, what if we actually did foot, core, diaphragm, pelvic, glute coordination training to actually accelerate the timing of the way that they're stabilizing? I would think that's actually a research study I need to talk to ASU about and say, this is what it should be. It's not just the textured insole that is activating it, but what I want this to do is to trigger the cascade that I just referenced: foot, core, pelvic, glute, lateral line, boom, right? I'm trying to trigger that to occur faster. This isn't a magic insert. It's still the subsequent motor coordination that we need to train.
And then you made a post recently about, I think you called it medial heel whip. And is that something that you worry about if you see somebody with that, if they don't have pain, let's assume? Is that something that you're going to correct right off the bat? Is that something that always causes pain downstream, upstream, or is that something that we leave alone?
A lot of people do this medial heel whip.
That's why I asked, because it's so
very,
common.
Very common. Oh my goodness. And it can often signify tight ankles or a tight anterior pelvis, which are very much related, right? Tight calves, tight quads, or tight hip flexors, right? So kind of that lower posterior, upper anterior that I was referencing. So if someone has that, then I take it in almost like a detective and just say, okay, are we dealing with all these other issues over here, or are these other patterns that I'm seeing you present with? And then you also have this medial heel whip, which is just confirming you have a tight psoas, tight hip flexors, tight ankles, and this is the compensation I'm picking up. But if you are experiencing adductor issues or something like that, then I would want to explore it even further. A lot of those things are very difficult to reverse and say, okay, this person is not ever going to really fully never do a medial heel whip again. That's not really how I look at it. It's just more guiding me into the areas of the body to investigate a little bit more.
Right. That makes sense. And do you ever see it happening at the knee? Like I guess you would call it the external tibial torsion. I don't know if I'm using that correctly, but it's like the hip can internally rotate and the ankle is fine, but it's like the femur is internally rotated relative to the tibia.
Oh my gosh, I see that all the time too. So I consider that like an egg beater walk is kind of how you could imagine someone walking, is that they are picking up the foot, and then as they pick up the foot to enter swing phase, the foot is circumducting out and kind of coming around, and then they'll place the foot back down. So that's how you would see. Some people will call it an external tibial torsion. Sometimes it's a tibial femoral external rotation, but it's something at the knee joint causing this circumductory movement. Just at baseline, I see any of those superfluous movements, right, as just energy leaks. Like that just as a baseline. If the people who are listening appreciate that, this little extra thing you're doing is just little lost energy, right? An athlete, you're trying to harness all of your power and really optimize the range of motion and the movement pattern that they're going through. So I would try to address it. I used to be a competitive cyclist as well, and I work with cyclists, and I see it in certain sports as actually very damaging to the knee joint. Yeah. So that's where I would actually, that concerns me a little bit more, is anytime the foot is fixed and you're trying to keep the knees in a certain alignment, but they're trying to torque it, then I see a lot of meniscus stress and posterior patella stress.
Yeah. And is there any like quick steps that you would take for that? I know that's tough to give out just random advice, but is there like some quick little steps that you would give if somebody had that external tibial torsion?
Yeah, I actually have a video on my YouTube, which is linked to EBFA Fitness, my education company. And I did a video where I show you turn your foot kind of like a clock, and your knee has to be bent, and you're trying to go from 12 o'clock to 11 o'clock if you're on your right foot, and you're turning in. And then there's another one where you can extend your leg, turn your foot to 11 o'clock, and then kind of flex it back in. So you're trying to activate the semimembranosus and semitendinosus, and then the medial gastroc to try to pull that knee into a more balanced position.
So if they're doing it the right way, they'll feel it like inner hamstring a little bit.
Oh, yeah. You should totally feel the inner hamstring engage.
Awesome. And then I've never heard anybody, I hear people talk about the medial heel whip. What about the opposite, the lateral heel whip? Do you ever see that? And is that an issue, or any thoughts there?
So the medial heel whip, just for the listeners to kind of like really appreciate what that is it's a compensation as you're going through late mid stance. So your leg is behind you, right? And if your leg is behind you and your hip flexors or your anterior pelvis is tight, right, then you can't take a long step. So you turn your foot out to try to open up the pelvis and kind of oblique the pelvis a little bit. And then that causes the heel to whip in, right? Or you're taking a step and you limit your ankle dorsiflexion. So you turn your foot out to kind of go around your ankles. So that's the medial heel whip. From the moving the leg the other way, that really, it would be harder to roll through the digits that way. But what you could see is a tibial femoral internal rotation, which is the opposite of the other one that we were just speaking about. This is where I would have people say, when I run, I kick my ankles and my ankles bleed every time I run. When I run, I scuff my shoes together. I actually will trip myself. And there's actually a lot of people that will say that, and I'll do trainings and I'll always have like a trainer in the back saying like, oh my God, I cannot run without kicking my ankles until they bleed. That will be a tibiofemoral internal rotation, or more of a torsion at the knee joint.
Okay. Yeah, I've had a few people with like a big lateral heel whip, but they're pretty good movers and not really in pain. But I have had two people, the only two people that I've ever had with Jones fractures or fifth metatarsal, they were big lateral heel whippers. And I think it was like they're avoiding the big toe and they're going around. And so they go to strike and they're too much on that outside edge.
100%. We do a lot of subconscious antalgic movements or compensation where we're trying to kind of avoid, which is why I am a big fan also on barefoot, unilateral, right? Trying to really get people out of these subconscious patterns that they probably don't even realize they're doing that. And then they're going to get a subsequent impact injury or overuse injury because they're moving the foot in like a wonky way and don't even realize it.
Yeah. Sometimes I feel like if you're avoiding that big toe, maybe there's no mobility there.
100%.
Like if you don't have the ability to flex that big toe, then you would probably just try to go around it.
Yep.
Any advice? Because I know that's a big thing, is having enough mobility in that big toe. Any quick advice on things that people could do?
One, rule out that there's any arthritis. So I always look to see that there's nothing structural. And I just worked with a athlete, he was an NBA player that was concerned over the first MPJ or the big toe. And it was trauma related, meaning a history of trauma prior, and it was accelerated arthritis. So when you jam turf toe, jam the toe, right? Compression of the toe, you start to open Pandora's box of accelerated arthritis. And part of arthritis in the big toe and trauma in the joint is contracture. So the inflammation causes a capsular contracture, which is a tight joint, right? So for them, depending on what the x-ray looks like, just stretching it, right? You're trying to stretch and open up and create joint space. Now, a lot of Instagram will show, okay, just prop your foot against a wall or a door or something and crank it up, right? There's a really important thing that your first metatarsal, which is the long bone, does when you lift your big toe or you extend your big toe is that the metatarsal has to drop. So if you are going to crank your toe up against anything, a door frame or anything, I know there's toe pros and all this stuff, you need to make sure that you are allowing or forcing the first metatarsal to drop. So there's something that's called a dancer's pad, and it is one of my favorite foot pads that kind of hacks within podiatry, and it just has a cutout. It's raised 2, 3, 4, 5, and then a cutout at the first to allow and to force the first metatarsal to drop, so that when it drops, you can lift the big toe over it. So that would be that is the biggest trick for anyone listening, is if you're going to prop your foot up and do that, make sure that you're allowing that first met head to drop. Make sure that it's actually not structural and kind of accelerated traumatic arthritis, and that you just have so much spurring and, you know, capsular contracture. You can't stretch that away. That is surgery.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you say that was? A dancer's
pad. Dancer's pad. Literally go to Amazon, dancer's pad, 1/4 inch felt. 1/4 inch felt, dancer's pad, any other material. Don't waste your time. Get felt. 1/4 inch.
Okay. Awesome. I'm going to look into that. Any advice for a basketball player or any athlete who is really trying to like develop the Achilles tendon, develop the spring from the lower leg? Because this is what all of us are obsessed over, is like, how do we get more spring? How do we get more elasticity? Any quick advice there? Is it like mainly plyometrics? Is there strength training drills that you use?
Yeah. So when you're thinking about optimizing the ankle torque, the ankle as a structure, right? The ankle has to catapult off of a rigid foot. And I'm saying rigid, meaning in a moment in time. It's not like structurally rigid, but you are using your intrinsic muscles isometrically to stiffen and stabilize your foot so that you can optimize the catapult effect of the Achilles tendon. So when I teach foot training, intrinsic foot exercises, they are all isometrically based. Short foot exercise, I'm sure you've heard of short foot. Short foot is a isometric contraction of the foot muscles, the intrinsics. And what that does is it creates a muscular myofascial tensioning response, a kind of a compacting action of the foot to then allow you to lever off of the ankle and the Achilles tendon. So I would make sure that as you're doing different drills for power and quick foot and dynamic and jumping and the whole ballistic nature of the ankle apparatus, is you have to have very strong connected intrinsic foot muscles. That's where it starts. That's where it starts. And of course that connects to your pelvic floor.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay. Last one. I know that you use the toe spacers. Can you give us a quick description on why, and then also what would you do in those toe spacers? Is that something you just wear to bed, you walk around in, or do you advise actually training in them?
Yeah, so toe spacers, these are a few for those that are kind of seen on the video. They are something that is made kind of like a stretchy, I'll call it silicone because it'll be easier for people to understand that. And it slides on in between all 5 digits, and there's an interspace. So you're essentially spreading, stretching, and opening up the digits and the forefoot. Now, first way that these were recommended was really bunions, hammer toes, neuromas. So we're thinking foot pathology, right, in the forefoot. But the way that I look at it is that when you stretch and open up the digits, you are stimulating the different fascia and ligaments that connect to your plantar fascia. So this is a really good reset to your plantar fascia, which could mean if you have plantar fasciitis, but really everyone. So it's a good reset, let's say in the form of a recovery, like you had said. However, what it is also reinforcing is that power in the forefoot is correlated to long, straight, flat digits. and this is just physics 101, is a lever arm. You can generate more torque the longer the lever arm, right? So if my digits, my toes are longer, straighter, flatter to the ground, I can create more torque through the MPJs when I push off. So really the rigid lever of the foot, which is what your foot looks like when you do a calf raise, that's a rigid lever. I want to catapult, kind of like the ankle, catapult through the MPJs and through these long digits. So it'll actually reinforce that. It'll help train, teach, reinforce this lever mechanism through the forefoot. That's how I like it. And then with people who have balance issues, it's a balance tool because toe flexor strength is correlated to balance. Toe flexor strength athletically is correlated to vertical jump and acceleration because you can lean your body forward, right? Think of you sprinting. You're actually leaning your upper body forward. Your center of mass changes based off of your toe flexor strength. So they're pulling into the ground. You can lean your body forward and essentially defy gravity in a sense.
Yeah.
So that's also correlated to using the toe spacers.
Yeah. And so where would you do these in dynamic drills? Would you run in them, or is it kind of like low level stuff?
Yeah, you can run in them. We have many people that will run, use them, train, jump, right? Obviously get used to it. If you're not in them, it's just going to feel like really weird.
Yeah.
But for those that are having a hard time or want to kind of take it to the next level, really access that foot, every aspect of that foot's potential, then that's where I would kind of play around with it. And I have heard amazing feedback from some people that use these.
Awesome. Where can the listeners find out more about you and about the company?
Yeah, so Naboso is, the website is naboso.com, naboso.com. We are on Instagram, Naboso_technology. My personal website for podiatry is my name, so dremilysplichal.com. And then if anyone wants to check out all the different YouTube videos I have, that's actually linked to my education company, which is ebfaglobal.com. And then any social for me, look up my name. I have to start my little Instagram over. Someone deactivated and hacked it. So
Oh, no.
I can't clear that right now. I know they're going, poof, 30,000 followers, but it's okay.
Jeez.
I know.
Are you on TikTok yet?
I am not. I'm not one of the cool kids on there yet. So.
Yeah, that could be your next step. TikTok.
There you go.
That's
Awesome.
I finally made the jump and I went all in on TikTok. That's where all the organic reach is right now.
Okay. Well, there we go. It was the sign from above. Leave Instagram, go to TikTok.
There we go. There's your sign. Awesome. And I'll put that in the show notes. I'll put all of her social media so you could check that out. And I really strongly recommend those products. Like I said, they made a huge difference for me, and our guys are loving them. So I know you guys are going to like them as well. Dr. Emily, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. It was awesome. Thank you so much.
All right. Have a good one.